The courtroom was oppressively still. The kind of stillness that magnifies every sound, every movement. Judge Malcolm Whitaker's gavel rested idly on his bench, an unspoken promise of power and control. The assembled crowd, mostly white, leaned forward in anticipation, the weight of the moment pressing down like the August heat outside. Isaac Bennett, a retired schoolteacher with a proud but weary posture, stood at the defendant's table. His dark skin was a stark contrast against the pale wood of the room, an unspoken reminder of the divide between him and the authority that sought to condemn him. "Mr. Isaac Bennett," Whitaker began, his voice cold, deliberate. Each syllable seemed to carry the verdict before it was spoken. "You have been found guilty of." The double doors of the courtroom burst open with a sharp crack. All heads turned, a collective gasp escaping as Senator Gabrielle Bennett strode in, her presence commanding, her heels tapping out a rhythm of defiance against the polished floor. Her tailored navy suit caught the light, reflecting her authority, but it was her eyes intense, unyielding that held everyone captive. "Objection," she declared, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. Whitaker's gavel froze mid-air. His pale face suddenly drained of its authority. The murmurs in the room grew louder, swelling with curiosity and unease. For a moment, time seemed to pause, the tension so thick it felt as though even the air was holding its breath. "Your Honor," Gabrielle continued, her voice steady, unwavering, "this trial is not about justice. It is about prejudice disguised as law." Whitaker's mouth opened, then closed, his composure cracking under the weight of her accusation. Gabrielle advanced, placing a folder of documents on the table with deliberate force. "I have proof that not only exonerates my father but exposes the rot within this courtroom." Isaac turned to look at his daughter, pride and apprehension mingling on his face. Gabrielle's presence was a reminder of all the battles they had fought, some won, many lost against an unrelenting tide of systemic racism. He had taught her to stand tall, but now he feared the cost of her courage. The journey to this moment had been anything but sudden. Racism rarely arrives as a single, cataclysmic event, it festers, a shadow lurking in the corners of daily life. Isaac Bennett had spent a lifetime navigating those shadows. As a teacher, he had faced the constant, quiet indignities, colleagues questioning his qualifications, parents doubting his ability to educate their children, students emboldened by their parents' whispered disdain. Whitaker, meanwhile, had been a silent antagonist long before this trial. 2 years earlier, he had dismissed Gabrielle's application to work in his courthouse, citing her lack of cultural fit. His words, polite on the surface, had sliced deeper than any overt insult. It was a rejection Gabrielle never forgot. Now, as the Senate Majority Leader, she had long since outgrown his petty prejudices. But the wound remained, a constant reminder of what her father had endured. The courtroom murmurs swelled again as Whitaker finally found his voice. "Senator Bennett," he said, his tone laced with thinly veiled disdain, "this is highly irregular." Gabrielle's lips curled into a faint smile, a glimmer of steel beneath her calm demeanor. "Irregular, Your Honor? Like convicting a man on the basis of lies and bias?" The crowd stirred uneasily. Gabrielle knew her words carried the weight of unspoken truths. Many in the room recognized the injustice but feared acknowledging it aloud. It was easier to let the system grind on than to confront the ugliness that underpinned it. Outside the courthouse, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing within. Racism in America was like that, insidious, often invisible until it exploded into view. Gabrielle had grown up watching her father bear its weight in silence. She had seen him passed over for promotions, harassed by police, and now accused of a crime he didn't commit. But Gabrielle was no longer a child watching from the sidelines. She was here, in the heart of the fight, wielding the tools her father had given her: courage, intellect, and a relentless belief in justice. The gavel, still frozen in Whitaker's hand, seemed to tremble. The courtroom had become a crucible, and Gabrielle intended to burn away every lie, every prejudice that sought to condemn her father. The fight was far from over. But in this moment, Gabrielle held the room. The echo of her voice was louder than Whitaker's gavel could ever be. It began long before the trial, long before the crime Isaac Bennett didn't commit. Racism, Gabrielle Bennett often thought, was like the slow drip of water against stone, not loud enough to wake the world but persistent enough to leave its mark. Her father's arrest was not an isolated storm, it was the result of years of erosion. In the weeks leading up to Isaac's arrest, the neighborhood had grown colder, less welcoming. Isaac, a man known for his warmth and generosity, noticed the shifts in subtle ways. The mailman, once friendly, now hurried past his porch without a word. His morning walks, once greeted with nods and small talk, had become solitary journeys, marked by side-eyed glances and curt avoidance. The break-in at the jewelry store was just the spark that ignited a tinderbox of suspicion. A witness, an elderly white man, claimed to have seen Isaac near the scene, though his description was vague at best. A tall black man with gray hair, he had said, as if that alone was evidence enough. The police, eager to close the case, latched onto the claim like a lifeline. Isaac's arrest felt inevitable, not because he was guilty, but because he was convenient. Gabrielle received the news while standing on the Senate floor. The call came from her mother, her voice trembling but restrained. "They've taken him," she said, not needing to explain who or why. Gabrielle left the Capitol immediately, her mind racing as she imagined her father, a man of quiet dignity, sitting in a jail cell, accused of something he couldn't even fathom. Arriving at the precinct, she was met with the kind of polite hostility reserved for people like her, a black woman in a position of power. The officer at the desk barely looked up as she introduced herself. "Senator Bennett," she said, her voice firm but measured. The officer's eyes flicked upward, registering her tailored suit and the authority she carried. He offered a thin smile, the kind that hid more than it revealed. "Your father's being processed," he said, leaning back in his chair as if to remind her who held the power in this room. Gabrielle knew better than to react. Anger, she had learned, was a weapon they wanted her to use against herself. Instead, she asked for the arrest report, her calmness cutting through the officer's practiced indifference. The report was as flimsy as Gabrielle had feared, a shaky eyewitness account. No physical evidence, and security footage that could have been anyone. Yet, it was enough for Judge Malcolm Whitaker to deny bail, citing Isaac as a flight risk. Gabrielle recognized Whitaker's hand in this immediately. He had been waiting for this moment, a chance to assert his authority, to remind the Bennetts of their place in a system built to contain them. Whitaker's prejudice was the kind that wore a mask of propriety. He spoke of law and order, of tradition and justice. But his rulings betrayed him. Gabrielle had seen it firsthand when she applied for a position in his courthouse years ago. "We're looking for someone more aligned with our values," he had told her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She remembered the sting of those words, how they had lit a fire in her that never fully dimmed. Isaac's arrest became the talk of the neighborhood, each retelling shaping the narrative in ways that reflected the teller's biases. To some, Isaac was a beloved teacher, unjustly accused. To others, he was a suspect who had finally slipped up. The truth didn't matter as much as the stories people chose to believe. Gabrielle saw the divide everywhere she turned, in the guarded expressions of her father's white neighbors, in the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, in the wary glances that followed her at the grocery store. Racism wasn't always loud, it was often quiet, insidious, a presence that settled into the cracks of daily life. The first challenge Gabrielle faced was gathering evidence to prove her father's innocence. The police were uncooperative, and the few witnesses she approached were reluctant to speak. "I didn't see much," one woman said, avoiding Gabrielle's eyes. Another simply shut the door in her face. The weight of her father's situation pressed down on her. But Gabrielle knew giving up wasn't an option. Her father had spent his life teaching her to stand firm, to fight for what was right even when the odds were against her. She carried that lesson now, along with the knowledge that the system was designed to break men like Isaac, to grind them down until they had no fight left. Late one night, as Gabrielle combed through the sparse evidence, she received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was low and gravelly, the kind that belonged to someone who had seen too much. "If you want to clear your father's name," the voice said, "check the courthouse archives. Look for Whitaker's old cases." The line went dead before she could ask who it was. Gabrielle stared at the phone, her heart pounding. It could be a trap, but it could also be the lead she desperately needed. She thought of her father, sitting in a cell, and decided she couldn't afford to ignore it. Gabrielle's challenges were mounting, each one more daunting than the last. But she understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about her father, it was about every man and woman who had been silenced, dismissed, or condemned because of the color of their skin. The fight was personal, yes, but it was also bigger than her, bigger than Isaac. It was a battle against a system that thrived on quiet oppression, on the everyday cracks that people like Judge Whittaker pretended not to see. And Gabrielle Bennett was determined to shatter it. The courthouse loomed in the distance, its neoclassical columns bathed in the pale light of a reluctant dawn. Gabrielle Bennett stood on the steps, gripping her father's case file like a shield. She had spent the night piecing together fragments of evidence, but the weight of what she lacked was crushing. Behind her, the city hummed to life, oblivious to the silent battles waged in its name. Inside, the courthouse was a world of whispered conversations and stolen glances. Gabrielle felt the eyes on her as she walked down the corridor. She was used to it by now, the way people assessed her. Not as a senator but as a black woman daring to occupy a space they believed wasn't hers. The stares weren't always hostile, some were curious, others indifferent, but they all carried the same underlying question. What is she doing here? Judge Malcolm Whittaker's courtroom was at the end of the hall, a polished door bearing his name in bold brass letters. Gabrielle paused before entering, steeling herself. She had faced adversaries in the Senate, debated policies that decided the fate of millions. But this felt different. This was personal, a confrontation with a man who embodied the very system she had fought against her entire life. As the trial resumed, Whittaker presided with an air of calculated authority. His voice was measured, his manner unshaken. To the casual observer, he was the picture of impartiality. But Gabrielle knew better. She could see it in the way he dismissed her father's defense attorney's arguments with a flick of his wrist. The way he leaned forward when the prosecution spoke, as if willing their flimsy evidence into something more substantial. The prosecutor, a sharp-suited man named Edward Langston, built his case on innuendo and implication. He played to the jury's biases, painting Isaac Bennett as a man who didn't belong near the affluent neighborhood where the crime occurred. Why was he there? Langston asked, his voice dripping with feigned curiosity. What possible reason could a man like Mr. Bennett have to be near that jewelry store at such an hour? Gabrielle's jaw tightened. The implication was clear. Isaac's presence alone was enough to make him suspect. It wasn't evidence they needed, it was the mere fact of his existence in a space deemed inappropriate for someone like him. The real battle, Gabrielle realized, wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the minds of the jurors, the spectators, the reporters scribbling notes for tomorrow's headlines. It was in the unseen biases that shaped their perceptions, the unspoken rules that governed their judgments. Racism, she thought, didn't need to shout to be heard. It thrived in the silences, in the spaces between words. Late that night, Gabrielle returned to her office, exhaustion pressing against her like a physical weight. She knew she was running out of time. Whittaker's courtroom was a fortress, designed to uphold not justice but the status quo. If she wanted to save her father, she needed to find a way inside. The anonymous call about Whittaker's past cases lingered in her mind. She called Camille, her contact in the courthouse. I need access to the archives, Gabrielle said, her voice firm despite the late hour. Camille hesitated. You know how dangerous this is, she replied. If Whittaker finds out, I don't care. Gabrielle interrupted. This isn't just about my father. It's about every person he's wronged, every life he's destroyed because he could. After a long pause, Camille agreed to meet her. Come after midnight, she said, and don't tell anyone. The courthouse at night was a different place, its corridors cloaked in shadows. Camille led Gabrielle to a dimly lit room, the scent of old paper and dust heavy in the air. She handed Gabrielle a stack of files marked confidential. What's in these? Gabrielle asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Patterns, Camille replied. Cases where Whittaker's rulings were questionable. Look for the ones involving minorities or women. You'll see. Gabrielle spent hours combing through the files, her stomach twisting with every page. Case after case revealed the same story, flimsy evidence ignored, exonerating testimony dismissed, harsher sentences for defendants of color. One file detailed a young black man convicted on the word of a single witness who later recanted. Another described a Latina mother whose children were taken from her because Whittaker deemed her unfit. The systemic nature of the injustice was staggering. Whitaker wasn't just a man with biases, he was a cog in a machine designed to oppress. As dawn approached, Gabrielle closed the last file. Her resolve hardened. She had what she needed to expose Whitaker. But she knew it wouldn't be enough to simply present the evidence. The system would protect him unless she found a way to force its hand. The next challenge was clear. She needed a witness who could corroborate what the files showed. Someone who could put a face to the injustice. Who could make the jury and the world see what she already knew. But finding that person would not be easy. Whitaker's reach extended far, and fear silenced many. Gabrielle was walking into a deeper fight. One where every step forward felt like dragging a boulder uphill. Yet, she could not stop. Her father's freedom depended on it. So did the freedom of everyone who came after him. The morning sun broke weakly through a veil of clouds as Gabrielle walked toward her office. The files clutched tightly in her hands. The city moved around her in its usual rhythm, cars honking, commuters rushing, but Gabrielle felt as though she were walking through quicksand. Each step was heavier than the last. The weight of what she had discovered the night before pressed against her. A cold reminder that justice, even when pursued relentlessly, often seemed just out of reach. In the days following her midnight trip to the courthouse archives, the challenges began to mount. The evidence Gabrielle uncovered was damning cases of blatant prejudice, rulings that twisted the law to serve bias rather than justice. Yet, she knew that facts alone wouldn't be enough. The truth, no matter how glaring, could always be buried under layers of legal jargon and societal indifference. Her first hurdle came in the form of an unexpected visitor, Edward Langston. The prosecutor. He arrived at her office unannounced, his polished demeanor masking the threat beneath. Senator Bennett, he began smoothly, lowering himself into a chair without waiting for an invitation. I hear you've been digging into Judge Whitaker's past. Gabrielle studied him, her face a mask of calm. And if I have? Langston leaned forward, his smile thin. I'd advise against it. These are sensitive matters, and stirring the pot could have consequences for your father. For your career. There it was, Gabrielle thought, the unspoken threat. The reminder of the precarious balance she walked as a black woman in power. She met his gaze steadily. My father is sitting in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. And you're worried about me, stirring the pot. I'd advise you to get out of my office. Langston's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. He stood, adjusting his tie. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Justice isn't supposed to be easy. Gabrielle replied, her voice like steel. Langston left without another word. But his presence lingered, a warning she couldn't ignore. Gabrielle's second challenge came from within the courthouse itself. Her friend Camille, who had risked her job to help her access the files, reported that Whitaker was tightening his grip. Rumors of internal investigations spread, and staff were warned against sharing information with anyone outside official channels. Be careful, Gabrielle, Camille said during a brief phone call. Whitaker knows someone's been looking into his cases. He'll retaliate if he finds out it's you. Gabrielle thanked her but didn't waver. She had anticipated resistance. What she hadn't anticipated was the growing divide within her own community. In her father's neighborhood, the tension was palpable. Isaac's arrest had become a lightning rod, polarizing the people who had once coexisted in fragile harmony. Some rallied behind him, organizing protests and demanding his release. Others, quietly influenced by their own prejudices, distanced themselves. At a local grocery store, Gabrielle overheard two white women whispering near the produce aisle. I heard he's been in trouble before, one said, her voice low but pointed. Exactly, the other replied. Where there's smoke, there's fire. Gabrielle froze, her fingers tightening around the basket she held. These weren't strangers, they were women her father had taught years ago. Women who had once praised him as a kind and patient teacher. Now, their whispers reduced him to a stereotype, a scapegoat. She turned away, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. It wasn't just Whitaker or the system that threatened her father, it was the quiet complicity of people who should have known better. Late one evening, as Gabrielle reviewed the files for the 100th time, her phone buzzed. It was her ally, Senator Elijah Monroe, with news of a breakthrough. We found a witness, he said, a delivery driver who saw someone near the jewelry store the night of the crime. He's willing to testify that it wasn't your father. Gabrielle exhaled, relief mingling with the tension that had been her constant companion. That's something, she said. It's not enough, but it's something. There's more. Elijah continued. He also got part of the license plate from the suspect's car. It's a solid lead. For the first time in weeks, Gabrielle felt a flicker of hope. But hope was fragile, she knew, and the road ahead was still fraught with obstacles. The next day, Gabrielle and Elijah met with the witness, a young man named Marcos Alvarez. His nervousness was evident, his hands fidgeting as he recounted what he saw. I was delivering a package, Marcos said, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw a man run out of the store, get into a car. It wasn't Mr. Bennett. The guy was younger, shorter. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Gabrielle asked gently. Marcos hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. I was scared. People like me, we don't usually get involved in stuff like this. It doesn't end well. Gabrielle nodded, understanding his fear. In a system that often treated marginalized communities as expendable, speaking out took immense courage. Thank you for coming forward now, she said. It means more than you know. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the backlash intensified. News outlets sympathetic to Whitaker's cause painted Gabrielle as a power-hungry politician exploiting her position for personal gain. Anonymous threats arrived in her inbox, warning her to stay in her lane. The whispers in the grocery store became louder, the stares sharper. Gabrielle knew she was walking a tightrope, her every move scrutinized, her every word dissected. Yet, she pressed on, knowing that the fight for her father's freedom was a fight for something larger, a fight against the quiet, insidious racism that seeped into every corner of daily life. The courtroom was no longer just a stage for justice, it had become a battleground. Every decision, every glance, every whispered comment from the jury box carried a weight that Gabrielle Bennett could feel pressing against her like the humid air before a storm. The system, she knew, wasn't designed for men like her father, Isaac Bennett. It wasn't built to exonerate them but to ensnare them. The trial had entered its most critical phase, and Gabrielle's evidence was ready. The witness testimony, the partial license plate, and the damning files exposing Judge Whitaker's history of bias were all lined up like soldiers in formation. But Gabrielle knew that facts alone wouldn't be enough. The courtroom, much like the world outside, operated on unspoken rules and invisible barriers, rules that bent and broke depending on who stood on trial. As the prosecution rested its case, Gabrielle sat in the gallery, watching Whitaker. His face betrayed nothing, his gavel an extension of his authority. But Gabrielle could see the cracks beneath his polished exterior. He was a man accustomed to control, and Gabrielle's relentless pursuit of justice had begun to unsettle him. The defense attorney rose, calling their star witness, Marcos Alvarez. The young delivery driver stepped hesitantly into the witness box, his nervous energy palpable. Gabrielle held her breath as he recounted what he had seen that night: a man fleeing the jewelry store, younger and shorter than Isaac Bennett, driving a car with a partial license plate that matched another suspect. The jury listened intently, but Gabrielle noticed the subtle shifts in their expressions. For some, Marcos's testimony was a revelation, a piece of the puzzle they hadn't expected. For others, it was an inconvenience, a challenge to the narrative they had already begun to form. As the prosecutor cross-examined Marcos, his tone shifted. "Mr. Alvarez," he began, his voice dripping with skepticism, "are you certain of what you saw that night?" Marcos hesitated, his gaze darting to Gabrielle before returning to the prosecutor. "Yes," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "I'm sure. Isn't it possible," the prosecutor pressed, "that your memory could be mistaken? The lighting was poor, was it not? And you were focused on your delivery, weren't you?" Marcos faltered, the weight of the question bearing down on him. Gabrielle felt her heart tighten. She had seen this tactic before: the slow erosion of credibility, the subtle suggestion that the witness's truth was less valid than the prosecutor's narrative. Outside the courtroom, the world seemed to mirror the battle within. Protests had erupted on the courthouse steps, supporters of Isaac Bennett clashing with those who believed in the prosecution's case. Signs proclaiming "Justice for Isaac" stood alongside others reading "Law and Order above all." The tension was thick, the air electric with the promise of confrontation. Gabrielle addressed the crowd one evening, her voice steady despite the chaos. "This trial isn't just about my father," she said, her words carrying over the murmurs. It's about a system that too often sees black men as suspects before it sees them as human. My father is innocent, but that doesn't matter to some. What matters is the color of his skin and the assumptions that come with it." Her words were met with cheers from some and jeers from others. A man in the back shouted, "You're playing the race card." Gabrielle's response was swift. "The race card? Sir, the deck has been stacked against us for centuries. Don't talk to me about fairness when the game was rigged before we even sat at the table." The media wasn't far behind, dissecting every moment of the trial, every word spoken in the courtroom. Conservative outlets painted Gabrielle as an opportunist, exploiting her position for personal gain. Liberal commentators hailed her as a champion for justice. But amidst the noise, the truth was often lost, drowned out by the narrative that people wanted to believe, rather than the reality Gabrielle was fighting to reveal. Back in court, Gabrielle's team introduced the files exposing Whitaker's history of biased rulings. The room fell silent as the defense attorney laid out case after case. Disproportionately harsh sentences for defendants of color. Rulings that ignored exonerating evidence. Comments made in court that revealed a deep-seated prejudice. Whitaker's composure finally cracked. "This is irrelevant," he said, his voice sharp, his gavel striking the bench like a thunderclap. "We're here to try Mr. Bennett, not to examine my record." Gabrielle rose from her seat, her presence commanding. "Your record, Judge Whitaker," she said, her voice echoing in the chamber, "is the reason my father is here. Your bias isn't a side issue, it's the foundation of this case." The tension in the room was palpable. Whitaker's face flushed, his control slipping. The jury exchanged uneasy glances. And for the first time, Gabrielle saw doubt creep into their expressions. The barriers Gabrielle faced weren't just institutional, they were deeply personal. The challenge of fighting against a system designed to marginalize was compounded by the subtle, everyday ways that racism manifested. It was in the prosecutor's tone, the jurors' hesitations, the media's framing. It was in the way people clung to their assumptions, even when confronted with evidence that should have shattered them. But Gabrielle refused to back down. Each challenge only strengthened her resolve, each obstacle a reminder of why she couldn't afford to fail. The fight wasn't just for her father, it was for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or condemned by a system that refused to see their humanity. The trial was far from over. But Gabrielle knew one thing for certain: the invisible barriers would not hold forever. And when they crumbled, they would make a sound that the world could not ignore. The courtroom was heavy with silence as the defense rested its case. Gabrielle Bennett sat motionless in the gallery, her eyes fixed on Judge Malcolm Whitaker. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the faint twitch of his jaw. He was a man struggling to maintain his veneer of control. But the weight of her evidence, the witness testimony, the files, the undeniable truth of his bias was beginning to bear down on him. The trial was no longer a question of guilt or innocence, it was a clash of ideologies. A fight over who held the power to define justice. Outside, the protests had reached a boiling point. The courthouse steps were a battlefield of signs and chants, each side shouting to drown out the other. Gabrielle's supporters called for accountability, demanding that the system recognize its failure. Opponents clung to the narrative of law and order, unwilling to admit that the law itself could be flawed. Gabrielle stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the chaos unfold. She saw familiar faces, students her father had taught, neighbors who had shared their lives with her family. But she also saw the faces of those who had turned away, who now stood with the opposition, their expressions hardened by fear or prejudice. It was the quiet moments of betrayal that cut the deepest. The grocery store clerk who no longer greeted her warmly, the church member who avoided her gaze during service, the whispers that reached her ears but were never spoken directly. These were the undercurrents of racism, the subtle ways it wove itself into the fabric of daily life, making its presence known without ever announcing itself. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor's closing arguments began. Edward Langston's voice was calm, measured, but his words were barbed. He painted Isaac Bennett as a man who didn't belong in the neighborhood where the crime occurred. He leaned on the witness's vague description, the grainy footage, the unspoken assumptions about who was likely to commit such a crime. "This case is not about race," Langston declared, his eyes sweeping the jury. "It's about evidence, and the evidence shows that Mr. Bennett was there that night. Gabrielle clenched her fists, resisting the urge to stand and shout. It wasn't the evidence Langston relied on, it was the jury's willingness to believe a narrative that had been told to them their entire lives. A narrative where black men were guilty until proven innocent, where their very presence in certain spaces was seen as a threat. The defense attorney rose, his tone starkly different from Langston's. He spoke of Isaac's life, his years as a teacher, his dedication to his students and community. He highlighted the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, the lack of concrete evidence, the new testimony that pointed to another suspect. But it was when he turned to Gabrielle's evidence against Whitaker that the room seemed to shift. He spoke of the files, the patterns of bias, the rulings that revealed a man who had used his position not to uphold justice but to enforce his own prejudices. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "this trial isn't just about Isaac Bennett. It's about whether we, as a society, are willing to confront the biases that have shaped our systems for far too long." The jury was sent to deliberate, and the tension in the courthouse was suffocating. Gabrielle paced the hallway, her thoughts racing. She had done everything she could, but she knew the outcome wasn't guaranteed. The jury was a reflection of the society they lived in, and that society was still deeply divided. Hours passed before the jury returned, their faces unreadable. Gabrielle sat beside her father, her hand gripping his tightly. The foreperson stood, the verdict trembling on their lips. "Not guilty." The words echoed through the courtroom, met with a mix of gasps, cheers, and stunned silence. Gabrielle felt the tension leave her body in a rush, tears streaming down her face as she turned to her father. Isaac's expression was one of quiet relief, his years of teaching composure carrying him through even this moment. But the victory was bittersweet. Outside the courthouse, the protests escalated. Opponents of the verdict decried it as a failure of the system, their chants growing louder, angrier. Gabrielle stepped into the chaos, her father beside her, and faced the crowd. "This is not the end," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is a beginning. My father's freedom is proof that truth can prevail. But the fight doesn't end here. We must confront the systems that allowed this to happen, the biases that nearly destroyed an innocent man's life." Her words were met with a mix of applause and resistance. She knew the battle ahead would be long. That change would come slowly, if at all. But in that moment, standing on the courthouse steps, she felt the stirrings of something powerful, a movement, a reckoning, a refusal to accept the world as it was. As the day ended, Gabrielle sat with her father on the porch of their family home. The quiet felt strange after the noise of the trial, but it was a welcome reprieve. Isaac sipped his tea, his gaze distant. "Do you think it'll change?" he asked softly. Gabrielle looked at him, her determination unwavering. "It has to," she said, "for you, for me, for everyone who comes after us." Isaac nodded, a faint smile on his lips. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, they had hope. And hope, Gabrielle knew, was the foundation of every revolution. The victory in the courtroom should have been enough to bring peace. But Gabrielle Bennett quickly realized that peace was a luxury the system rarely afforded to those who challenged its authority. Isaac Bennett's acquittal was met with celebration in some circles, but in others, it was a spark that ignited resentment, a symbol of a changing world that many were unwilling to accept. The morning after the verdict, Gabrielle woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. Threats flooded her inbox, some anonymous, others brazen enough to include names. One message read, "Your father may be free, but you'll never change what we believe." Another warned, "Watch your back, Senator. You've stirred up trouble." Gabrielle stared at the screen, her chest tightening. She had always known this fight would come at a cost, but the weight of it was heavier than she anticipated. Her father's freedom had come with a price, a spotlight that illuminated the ugly truths many preferred to keep hidden. Isaac, too, felt the backlash. At the local diner where he had been a regular for decades, the staff who once greeted him warmly now barely acknowledged his presence. The table he usually occupied was suddenly reserved, forcing him to sit near the kitchen, where the clatter of dishes and the smell of grease served as a reminder that he was no longer welcome. Gabrielle watched her father endure these slights with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through his arrest and trial. But she could see the toll it was taking. His once easy smile was now rare, his laughter muted. He spent more time on the porch, staring into the distance, as if searching for the man he used to be. Meanwhile, Judge Whittaker had not gone quietly into the shadows. The investigation into his history of biased rulings was ongoing, but he used every tool at his disposal to fight back. In interviews with sympathetic media outlets, he painted himself as a victim of political overreach, a martyr for traditional values, under attack by a radical agenda. Gabrielle watched these interviews with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Whittaker's words were carefully chosen, designed to stoke fear and division. He didn't need to say the quiet part out loud, his audience already understood. To them, Gabrielle wasn't a daughter fighting for her father's innocence, she was a threat to their way of life. A reminder that the balance of power was shifting. The challenges mounted when Gabrielle received a subpoena to testify before a Senate committee. Whittaker's allies had called for an investigation into her interference in the judicial process, framing her actions as a misuse of her political power. It was a calculated move, designed to discredit her and deflect attention from Whittaker's own misconduct. The hearing was held in a grand chamber, its high ceilings and marble pillars exuding authority. Gabrielle sat at a wooden table, her back straight, her expression calm. The senators questioning her were sharp, their words laced with accusation. "Senator Bennett," one began, leaning forward with a practiced frown, "do you believe it's appropriate for a member of Congress to involve themselves in an ongoing judicial matter?" Gabrielle met his gaze without flinching. "I believe it's appropriate for anyone regardless of their position to stand up against injustice. My father was being railroaded by a biased judge. As his daughter, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. As a senator, I had the resources to act." Her words were met with murmurs from the audience, some approving, others critical. The hearing dragged on for hours, each question more pointed than the last. But Gabrielle refused to be rattled. She knew the stakes were high not just for her but for everyone who had ever dared to challenge the system. As the hearing concluded, Gabrielle stepped outside into a sea of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and voices clamored for her attention. She took a deep breath, then spoke, her voice steady despite the chaos. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about a system that has failed too many for too long. I won't apologize for fighting for my father. And I won't stop fighting for justice. If standing up for what's right makes me a target, so be it." Her words were broadcast across the nation, drawing both praise and condemnation. Supporters flooded her office with messages of encouragement, while critics doubled down on their attacks. The divide was stark, a reflection of the country itself. That evening, Gabrielle returned home to find her father waiting for her on the porch. He looked up as she approached, his face softened by the warm glow of the porch light. "How is it?" he asked, his voice low. "Tough," she admitted, sinking into the chair beside him. "But worth it." Isaac nodded, his eyes searching hers. "You've always been brave," he said after a moment. "But don't forget to take care of yourself, too." Gabrielle smiled, a small but genuine expression. "I will," she promised. "But there's still so much to do." Isaac reached for her hand, his grip firm despite the weariness in his bones. "You're doing the right thing," he said, "even if it feels like the world's against you." Gabrielle squeezed his hand, her resolve strengthening. The fight was far from over. But she wasn't alone. The fire beneath her had been ignited, and she would carry it forward, no matter the cost. Injustice, she knew, thrived in silence, but she had learned to make noise to speak, to act, to refuse to be complicit. And in doing so, she had become a force that the system could no longer ignore. The days following Gabrielle Bennett's Senate testimony were a blur of interviews, meetings, and strategy sessions. The momentum she had built with her father's acquittal had turned into a larger movement, one that demanded not just accountability for Judge Whittaker but systemic change. Yet, for every step forward, she felt the pull of resistance, a deep-rooted fear of what justice truly meant for a society so accustomed to inequity. Whittaker's allies were relentless in their campaign against her. Editorials in major newspapers accused her of overstepping her role, framing her as an ambitious politician exploiting her father's case for personal gain. Television pundits dissected her every word, twisting her fight for justice into a narrative of division. "Senator Bennett represents the worst kind of politician," one commentator declared on a prime-time show. "She's willing to tear down our institutions for the sake of her own agenda." Gabrielle watched the broadcast with a calm exterior. But inside, her frustration simmered. It wasn't just her fight they were undermining, it was the fight of every person who had been silenced, ignored, or vilified by the system. She turned off the television and sat in silence, her thoughts heavy. The cost of truth, she realized, was steep, but the cost of silence was far greater. The investigation into Whitaker's rulings gained traction as more victims came forward. Gabrielle's release of the files had emboldened others to share their stories, men and women whose lives had been upended by his biased decisions. A mother who lost custody of her children. A young man incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit. A woman whose career was derailed by Whitaker's casual cruelty. Their voices formed a chorus, one that could no longer be ignored. But as the truth came to light, so did the threats. Gabrielle's security detail was increased after a brick was thrown through her office window. A note attached that read, "Stay in your lane." Her staff urged her to scale back her public appearances. But Gabrielle refused. Fear, she knew, was the weapon of those who sought to maintain control. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Her father, Isaac, had become a reluctant symbol of the movement. Though he preferred the quiet of his porch, he found himself thrust into the spotlight. His story told and retold in newspapers and on television. "I'm just a man who wanted to teach," he said in an interview, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. "I never wanted to be the face of anything. But if my story helps even one person, then it's worth it." Isaac's humility resonated with many. But it also drew criticism from those who saw him as a threat to their comfortable narratives. One night, as he walked home from the diner, a group of men followed him, their voices low but menacing. "Think you're better than us now?" one of them sneered. "Think you can just walk around like you own this place?" Isaac didn't respond. He kept walking, his heart pounding, but his steps steady. When he reached home, he locked the door and sat in the dark, the weight of the encounter settling over him like a shroud. He didn't tell Gabrielle she had enough to worry about, but the memory stayed with him. A reminder of the quiet dangers that came with their fight. The tipping point came when the Judicial Review Board announced its findings. Judge Whitaker's history of biased rulings was undeniable, and the board recommended his removal from the bench. The decision sent shockwaves through the legal community, sparking debates about the integrity of the judiciary and the role of systemic racism in shaping outcomes. Gabrielle stood on the courthouse steps as the news broke, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about one judge," she said. "It's about a system that allowed him to thrive, that protected him while he destroyed lives. Removing him is a step. But it's not the end. We have to keep going. We have to demand better." In the weeks that followed, Gabrielle worked tirelessly to push for reforms. She introduced legislation aimed at increasing oversight of judges and reducing disparities in sentencing. The road ahead was long, and progress was slow, but Gabrielle felt a sense of purpose that carried her through even the darkest moments. Her father, too, began to find his footing again. The diner staff started greeting him warmly once more, their initial coldness replaced with quiet admiration. Neighbors who had avoided him began stopping by, offering kind words and gestures of support. The changes were small, almost imperceptible, but they mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Gabrielle and Isaac sat on the porch together. The air was cool, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. Gabrielle sipped her tea, her mind already racing with the tasks of tomorrow. "You've done something extraordinary," Isaac said, breaking the silence. Gabrielle turned to him, her expression softening. "We've done it together," she replied. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Isaac smiled, his eyes glistening with pride. "The world's not perfect," he said. "It might never be. But because of you, it's better than it was." Gabrielle reached for his hand, her resolve firm. The fight for justice was far from over. But in that moment, she felt the strength of all who had come before her, and all who would come after. The cost of truth was high, but its value was immeasurable. And as the stars began to appear in the sky, Gabrielle knew that their work, their legacy would shine just as brightly. Even in the darkest of nights.